Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kerry Neal from UNICEF headquarters in New York. It's a real honor for me to chair this panel. It's an illustrious panel. I think they've all got a lot to say. I won't speak too much before I introduce my first speaker, but I just highlight, in the break, we were having a discussion and somebody was saying, how did we arrive at the wording and the term legal identity? Because obviously we're taking Sustainable Development Goal 16.9, and this is the commitment to achieve legal identity for all, and it's perhaps not an obvious choice of wording or terminology. And it's just to say it was the result of a very long and involved process of political negotiation between member states and different parts of the United Nations system. And I think some of what people will be speaking about this afternoon will highlight why that was such a long and interesting debate, which finally arrived at us seeing a global commitment to achieve legal identity for all by 2030.
A great pleasure to be here and amongst the crowd where I feel at home. Last week, myself and a couple of other people here were at a meeting, ID for Africa, where a lot of the people in the space, 1,500 of them, were from the private sector biometric technology crowd and national population registry representatives from governments as well. And it was notable how this subject was not really on that agenda. So, for those of you who don't know, Sustainable Development Goal Target 6.9 is by 2030, provide legal identity for all, including birth registration. And the indicator set is the number of children under 5 who have birth registration. The first problem with this target is that under international human rights law, we all, in fact, do have a legal identity, whether or not we have a document. So the issue, therefore, is what do we mean by legal identity? Is this actually about a proof of legal identity? But we can take that as read. The second problem is that the official indicator is restricted to birth registration, and those who developed this target were clearly aware that birth registration wasn't quite enough, but unable to come up with a consensus about what would be enough, what would be the language that would work. So the target has been looked at through various lenses. Different communities have picked a lens that they would like to look through. We can talk about a development and planning lens, the idea that we need to know who is in the country so we can plan how many schools, so we can think about hospitals, so we can economically empower people. People who do not have an identity document tend to be financially excluded. We can talk about it through a national security lens, including migration and border control. We need to know who's in the country because we need to know who the bad guys are. We need to be able to track them. We can also think about it through a child protection role, which is, of course, the traditional, or one of the traditional emphasis on birth registration. Civil registration in general, of course, being very much a foundation for development as well, but one of the key roles of birth registration being about child protection, and exclusion from birth registration has implications for the rights of that child. And then there's a way in which, and this is where the technology companies come in, that we think about legal identity as fundamentally a question of biometrics and our digital lives, as well as the representations of our bodies. So from the development point of view, here is a quote from the World Bank. Inclusive, secure, and trustworthy identification systems can empower individuals, enhance their access to rights, services, and the formal economy, strengthen the capacity of governments, private sector, NGOs, administer programs, and deliver services transparently and efficiently and effectively. So far, so positive, but also so incomplete. National security. Less positively. This, my Kenyan friends will be very pleased to know, is a quote from the Kenyan government relating to a new national digital identity system in Kenya. Once the database is in place, it'll be easy to identify the individuals that would potentially pose serious threats to public safety and our national security. Police officers will be able to identify criminal elements and track the footsteps of their operation with appreciable accuracy. And there's a strong degree to which much of the debate around this was evident in the discussions in Johannesburg last week from national identification authorities, that national security is for some actors a key driver behind the legal identity goal. And part of that is also migration and border management. So the Global Compact for Migration has an objective, which is to ensure that all migrants have proof of legal identity and adequate documentation, and has a set of elaborations on that which have a rights focus, but nonetheless it is clear that many governments are seeing that not so much as a question of rights, but as a question of control. So child protection, classic quote from UNICEF about the importance of birth registration for child protection. And indeed, birth registration is being essential to the prevention of statelessness. But the main focus of UNICEF and other actors who focus on birth registration is about the protection of the rights of the child as a child, with less emphasis usually on the question of access to nationality, because that is so political. The development objectives are clearly positive, but the rhetoric and position there is that simply having a unique identifier will create economic empowerment for the individual concerned, with a reluctance to look at the question of, well, what else does this unique identifier say about you? Does it, in fact, include a status which gives you protection of your rights, which would be either nationality of the country where you are or of another country, or refugee status, or possibly protection as a stateless person? Would you like to hear about the opportunities or the threats first? Do you want to finish on an optimistic note or finish on a pessimistic note? Okay, I'm going to finish on an optimistic note. How many people know this abbreviation? Anybody? Single source of truth. This is a known term in identification systems design, and of course it makes sense. It means that if you alter a value in a database in one place, it percolates throughout the database and you don't have to correct it multiple times. This is also a favorite phrase in connection with national identity systems. We will have a single source of truth. And of course, we know that many people who are stateless or of undetermined nationality or at risk of statelessness, they fit themselves into the margins where they can find a space to live using documents that will allow them to access at least some services, even if they're excluded from voting, for example. But a single source of truth will make that more difficult. The opportunity is, of course, leave no one behind, as the overall objective of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I do think that there are some opportunities as we think about system design in the context of the SDGs and the legal identity target. And finally, what is legal identity? It does not have a definition. Should we not be trying to define it as including a nationality?
Good afternoon to all. First of all, I would like to thank to organizers for the invitation to speak at this conference. As a Roma activist from Montenegro, I will try to address the issue of statelessness when it comes to Roma community. For those who maybe don't know, even though according to official data, the Roma community is the largest minority in Europe. Roma community is also the most marginalized and discriminated Roma group, ethnic group in Europe. When it comes to Western Balkan countries, through age, Roma community is faced with systemic discrimination and exclusion. Most of them live in segregated communities without access to electricity, water, social welfare, and etc. Although the law of Montenegrin citizenship prescribes the possibility of acquiring Montenegrin citizenship for a stateless person, this right stateless person can hardly realize in practice. In 2011, the governments of Montenegro and Kosovo signed the agreement on the subsequent registration of internal displaced person from Kosovo residing in Montenegro in the Register of Births and the Register of Citizens of the Republic of Kosovo in order to establish cooperation in resolving the status of internally displaced person from Kosovo that are residing in Montenegro. However, despite these efforts, it is estimated that around 4,000 people are at risk of becoming stateless. Also, stateless persons are not covered by the social and child protection system. They absolutely do not have the possibility to use the right to social and child protection, even though they are staying in territory of the country and meet the other specified condition for the realization of this right. This fact particularly affects the members of the Roma community who are potentially at risk to become stateless. To use of the right to social and child protection is closely linked with the possession of citizenship, so therefore has a discriminatory character. This is also some criteria that stateless person cannot have in Montenegro or in the other countries in Western Balkan. And for the end, undefined legal status and lack of evidence of identity are the basic reasons that make it difficult for a person without citizenship to exercise the right to the education. Because of this, a number of stateless children, mostly Roma children, are not included in the education system due to the lack of documentation. The most vulnerable are children who are not enrolled with birth register. So, despite the efforts made to reduce the statelessness, we continue to face certain challenges in the implementation of international standards in this area in Montenegro.
Hi. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the perspectives that Bronwen already introduced, and in particular to try to talk about some of the actors that inhabit those agendas, and a little bit about this present moment. Because I think what's really important is that a lot of the opportunities that we might see and identify have to do more with changing people's minds than changing, the national security agenda, right? So we have to know a little bit, something about the people who are moving in this universe. And I identify several different fields within the legal identity space, such as it is. Those include the digital identity for development field that Bronwen already introduced, which is mostly inhabited by development financing institutions and vendors, virtually unregulated by any kind of normative or regulatory structure, no centralized oversight body, and certainly no civil society, no potent civil society engagement. There's a self-sovereign identity field that is mostly technologists looking for alternatives to big state-based platforms. The idea that you can authenticate yourself independent of a state and technological solutions associated with that in search of a problem, perhaps. Global privacy and civil liberties, which I'll come back around to at the end, is a huge field that's really deeply engaged in this area, especially when it comes to digital identification systems. And one of my main points, an opportunity and potentially a threat, is the fact that the citizenship field, which is another one, child protection, humanitarian actors, the folks who are in this room at this conference are really siloed off in many ways from the privacy and civil liberties field, which has a robust response and a sort of growing response and legal arguments to address some of the harms that they identify associated with the introduction of especially biometric registries. I think the first opportunity is really that we're all becoming more fluent in this multifaceted concept of legal identity, and there are real opportunities to build wider coalitions of civil society groups, and I don't think personally that it's too late to change minds and influence over the next probably 5 to 10 years when the digital transition happens in most of the world, especially in the global south, how this is going to happen and how identification functions either as a tool for addressing statelessness or in terms of infringements of privacy, et cetera. It has massive implications. So the World Bank, as I said, is a major actor in this field. They're investing, they've promised $750 million, I think around 2017, now $1 billion to build digital ID systems. And the main prototype, the main model for that is the Aadhaar System in India, which is a national biometric register that covers 1.2 billion people right now, and it's actually citizenship blind. It covers both citizens and permanent residents of India, but there's just beginning to be research done about actually what does that mean, how does that play out in practice, looking at the citizenship dynamics of discrimination and access to citizenship, disputed populations, and we know in particular in Assam, which is a region and an issue that we'll discuss certainly in other panels here at this conference, penetration of Aadhaar registration is only at 10%, whereas it's up in the 90s in other parts of India. So on the other side of the slide here, you see World Bank's pipeline. I think this is from an older annual report, but they're performing advisory functions. Their national task teams are investing in a range of countries all over the world in new digital identity systems. One other opportunity coming out of the World Bank's efforts, and they have elaborated principles along with a number of different partners, including other donors, UN agencies, et cetera, is that they have recognized some of the risks in what they call the national enabling environments, including the lack of data protection laws, but also disputed citizenships, problematic registration laws, dysfunctional registration authorities, et cetera. And so they've developed a very extensive assessment tool that they use and deploy that they're still testing and developing. It's called the IDEEA, ID Enabling Environment Assessment. And this is actually an opportunity for civil society actors and others to try to engage at the point when the World Bank is considering a new system. Or considering engaging with a state on a national ID or within a region. So the more that we're able to learn about and feed into those systems and the more transparent the World Bank is about its decision making here is important because after the World Bank does decide to engage, there's very little scope for advocacy connected with the rollout, the design and rollout of a new ID system. So I have here Melvin Kranzberg's famous first law of technology. Technology is not good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And I'll introduce you to Bingham's first law of digital ID, which is that techno-utopianism is bad for the furthest behind and bad for business. Because what I've seen happening, and here I'm standing on the shoulders of many colleagues who know a lot more about the privacy space, is that states also have very low capacity. And the situation we have right now is that vendors are dominating this space. They're approaching states with techno-utopian solutions for everything. They end up being extremely costly and poorly designed. The vendors lock in their position with states so that if they ever want to update anything, they're stuck. They don't train them how to implement the systems. There's no civil society engagement in the design or rollout or any talk of changing the regulatory framework ahead of time.
So like Bronwen, the subtitle of this panel caught my attention immediately, namely Opportunity or Threat. And I will spend my time essentially analyzing that question on the basis of what we know so far. And for those of you who are feeling horribly depressed, the good news is it's going to be a little more positive. I'm going to leave aside for the moment questions about birth registration that is color-coded or otherwise marked so as to exclude people from citizenship, and just make the point that as a general matter, civil registration is helpful, and the opportunity we all now have to frame birth registration as a development issue and not just a human rights one is positive. Initiatives on birth registration have indeed ramped up. Perhaps most notably in Asia, which has developed a 10-year regional initiative, and Africa, but also in the Americas and the Middle East and elsewhere. The idea of full ID coverage for all certainly seems fundamental to 16.9. The World Bank estimates that over 1 billion people worldwide have no proof of identity whatsoever. I think it's clear that the intention behind 16.9 is to close that identity gap. Indeed, when a large number of institutions came together in 2018 to adopt a set of principles on identification for sustainable development, including UNHCR and UNICEF and others, it was easy for us to reach agreement that inclusion would be the first principle, and that this meant full and universal ID coverage for all persons on the territory. Given that legal identity wasn't defined, as people who work on statelessness, and Bronwen has already raised this, we naturally ask whether legal identity can be understood in this context to include nationality. After all, there's some support in human rights law for the notion that legal identity includes nationality. We can look, for example, at CRC Article 8.1, which says that states parties undertake to respect the right of the child to preserve his or her identity, including nationality, name, and family relations. And yet, obviously, I think this is obvious, I hope this is obvious, if you make an argument to states that by signing up to the SDGs, they committed to provide everyone on their territory with a nationality, you won't be taken seriously. So in that sense, you can't really make the case that legal identity in SDG 16 always includes nationality. Having said this, you can make the case to states that resolving statelessness and preventing statelessness is consistent with their SDG 16.9 commitment, as well as with the overriding objective of leaving no one behind. And we at UNHCR have accordingly used the Sustainable Development Agenda to frame prevention and resolution of statelessness as a development issue. In Central Asia, this has become the central framing device of our dialogue. For example, the conference we held there last year with governments was entitled Leaving No One Behind at Birth, the Right to Legal Identity and the Prevention of Statelessness. And it allowed for discussion of improved access to birth registration, as well as safeguards in nationality law against childhood statelessness. In the Middle East, where the use of the word statelessness can shut down dialogue in an instant, there's an acceptance of the language of legal identity to the point where 2018 saw the League of Arab States adopt a declaration on legal identity and belonging. That declaration calls upon states to do a number of things that would help end statelessness, including to grant women and men equal rights in conferring nationality. So those are some of the opportunities that we see. Increasing birth registration coverage helps with prevention of statelessness. Expanding ID coverage to all persons on the territory may lead to better outcomes for stateless people in terms of basic ability to function. And even if we can't say that 16.9 means that everyone on the territory is entitled to nationality, we can use it in combination with human rights law to argue credibly that some people on the territory with strong links are entitled to nationality. And certainly we can make the case, and are making the case to governments, that ending statelessness is consistent with 16.9. Phew, that's the opportunities. What about the potential downsides or pitfalls? The ambiguity of legal identity and the fact that the only agreed indicator relates to birth registration has led some to take the view that it's only about birth registration. That's limiting, but it's hardly a threat, as having an SDG about birth registration only is still better from the point of view of statelessness prevention than not having one at all. The more significant potential downsides include some that Laura and Bronwen have flagged. As ID coverage improves, globally many people who've been living in the shadows may be more exposed as stateless. There's a risk that people who have been blending in settings where ID coverage is weak may effectively become more differentiated from the general population. This may have upside potential on the sort of flip side if it leads to improved data on statelessness and awareness of the problem and the need to resolve it. And this is what I think we have to encourage. But there is certainly a legitimate protection concern there. Other potential downsides relate to data privacy and protection of civil rights as more and more information is potentially linked to people's digital ID or profile. Those are hugely important issues, but they're of general concern rather than specific to statelessness. So apart from the issue I've already flagged, I won't discuss them other than to note that many actors are now working in this space on the question of what constitutes good ID. Relevant to the statelessness issue, there's a concern that some have that the proliferation of ID systems, including ones that rely on private sector technologies, could take away from government investment in civil registration and weaken government accountability for civil registration. That is something I think we need to watch.
Good afternoon. They normally say beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, right? And I never used to understand that phrase, but it dawned on me when I was applying for my scholarship, for my application to attend university. That is when I had my passport. I was so happy I have this passport. I'm going to use this one since I didn't have my identification card. But when I reached there, the registrar told me, this is just a traveling document. We cannot register you for university because you have just a traveling document. We need you to come with your ID and register for you to be enrolled in school. That was the hassle of my life. I've lived with a single parent, and it has been hassle since getting the document because accessing nationality after the Constitution of 2010, whereby it gave responsibility to both parents to issue nationality to their children. But to me and the registrars in Kenya, the law applies in the Constitution, but on the ground, it's still not working. So many members of the community do not have access to documentation, and most of them have lost hope because they have applied and applied and applied. Most of them have lived up to 4 to 10 years looking for options to apply for these documents. But they are not considered stateless, but they are facing challenges in accessing services. And we always forget about them. We might sing, we might talk about birth certificate to everyone, but the parents do not understand the importance of these birth certificates. That is why we brought the school program, whereby we can use the students. We want to know what the students think about nationality and what they think about citizenship, so that they can use this tool and this information to pass it to their parents and make their parents understand that birth certificate is one of the tools that will consider me a Kenyan. But funny enough, it has only been changed few months or few years ago. In the birth certificate of Kenya, it had been written down that this is not a proof of nationality. So, what is the proof of nationality? This is the outreaches that we normally do. What we do is door-to-door activities because we realized many people in Africa are ignorant. So the only way to make them understand the importance of nationality is use the paralegal tool, go outside there and make them understand. Ask them questions. What do you understand? Do you have a birth certificate? What is the importance of birth certificate? And many of the Kenyans have been affected, let alone the Nubians. all Kenyans have been affected when there was introduction of national education management system. It's called NEMIS, whereby every child was not to access education or register for school without a birth certificate. It's a good tool, yes, but so many children have been left out. And this is a question I will put to UNHCR. We're thinking about legal identity for all and issuance of birth certificates. But have we put the precautions of making sure that those people, the children who do not have the legal documents to get these documents, how are they going to get these documents? We are talking about legal identity for all. Let's say by 2030, we've managed to reach 99% of legal identity. We'll be so much happy that we've managed to reach 99%. But let's not forget that 1% is the thing that is bringing us here. That 1%, that Kenyan example is we have 45 million approximately. Let's say we've been able to manage to register 44,900,000. That is 99%. The 100% will never be achieved because 100,000 people have been left out. And that is the reason why we're here. So as we are looking at registering and reaching 99%, let's not forget that in order to manage and make sure that everyone is considered and there is legal identity for all, it has to reach 100%.
Okay, thank you. I think you'll agree that was an excellent selection of speakers, going from very broad global international processes down to very specific examples of what does a lack of legal identity mean for an individual in a particular context.